We're going to Hikaru Nakamura and Viktor Mikhalevski's game in 2007. The times when Nakamura played more aggressively. Knight to f3, knight to f6, c4, the English opening. Let's just say for now. g6, knight to c3, d5. The blacks want to play the Grunfeld defense. Nakamura continued to play with the queen to a4. Bishop to d7, queen to b3. You might ask this question: why would a very powerful player like Nakamura agree to move queen a4 and then back to b3? First and foremost, we can state that the blacks typically do not prefer to play the bishop to d7 move. As a result, the queen's relationship with the center is disrupted. At the same time, both the b7 pawn and the d5 pawn are on demand. If the principle of playing the queen early, which is one of the most general principles, is violated in this way, then there must be a very strong idea behind it. Now Mikhalevski continued the game with d takes c4 move. The queen takes c4, knight to c6, d4, bishop to g7, e4, and kingside castling. As you can see, Nakamura has a very strong center. But this has a price. He's falling further behind his opponent in terms of development, and his king remains in the center. He needs to be careful. Here, Nakamura continued the game with the e5 move, demonstrating his dominance in the center. As we can see, there aren't many suitable squares for the blacks to escape their knights. Here, Mikhalevski makes the bishop to e6 intermediate move to play his knight to d5 square, where he can be very active. If the queen retreats, the knight will be able to play d5. However, Nakamura had an ingenious plan. E takes f6. Before the opening is finished, Nakamura sacrifices his queen. Let's see. The bishop takes c4. Now f takes g7. And the beauty of it is that the rook is under demand. That's why the blacks don't have time to protect their bishop. The king takes g7. The bishop takes c4. Now Mikhalevski has played knight to d4. It makes perfect sense. The knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and bishop takes e2. As you can see, Nakamura now has the bishop pair and the knight in exchange for the queen and two pawns he sacrificed. Of course, the critical question here: I wonder if the whites will be able to compensate this sacrifice. But it looks like the minor pieces are going to dominate the board. Now, after the bishop to e2 move, Mikhalevski continues to play with queen b4. Here, the blacks want to hinder their opponent's development as much as possible, particularly the development of the queen side. Now, Nakamura continues with a kingside castling, the rook f to d8 and rook to b1. In a moment, we can better understand the purpose of this move. Now, rook to d7 and b3. That was Nakamura's idea. He will also try to complete the development by developing the queen side. Of course, the open knight cannot be taken because the queen will be lost with the bishop to b2 move. Mikhalevski played the king to g8, and now the knight is on demand. Therefore, the knight to a4. The blacks appear to have the line d with the rook a d8. But the whites perfectly control the rook's critical entry points. Now, we're seeing the a3 move from Nakamura. He's attempting to force the queen into more passive, dysfunctional squares. The queen to e4, and now he protected his rook with the bishop to e3 move. And of course, one of the threats here is the knight c5. That's why we saw the b6 move from the blacks. It makes sense. Now, the knight to c3, queen to e5, and rook b to c1. Here, Mikhalevski took an original approach and continued to play with rook to d2 move, although the machine did not like it very much. It's a sacrifice. But it seems that these particular minor pieces of Nakamura must have disrupted Mikhalevski. Because as you can see, when the black bishop is not on the board, the blacks can always have trouble with the king side. And perhaps, if the blacks had accepted this sacrifice, they would have become more active and took the black bishop from their opponent. However, Nakamura, who sacrificed his queen at the opening, had already demonstrated that he was uninterested in the material, and he does not yet respond to his opponent's request. He continues with rook f to e1. He cast a glance at the opposing queen. Now c5. We can see what the blacks are trying to do. He's mobilizing his queenside multiplicity and attempting to limit his opponent's very dangerous bishop to the pawn chain. Let's see. Bishop to c4 and rook 2 to d3. The blacks are trying to force the sacrifice, but here Nakamura played the bishop to h6 move first. Now that he's paved the way for the queen's attack, he's indirectly protecting his knight on demand. Queen to h5, and Nakamura says, "You asked for a sacrifice?" And now he has accepted this sacrifice. The bishop takes d3, and here Mikhalevski understandably prefers the black bishop. The queen takes h6, because guys, as we just said, this bishop has always been a piece that contributes to the formation of the checkmate. But we can't ignore the other bishop in any way. It's also too strong. After queen takes h6, now the bishop to c4, e6, and a4. And here, the blacks reveal their activation efforts with rook d2. The knight to e4. The white's pieces are much more harmonious. Now the rook to d4 against knight to e4. That's the idea of the black's tempo. Now the threat is the rook takes e4 and then the queen takes c1. It's very important. That's why Nakamura used rook to c3 to flee this threat. At the same time, the rook can move to f3 and h3. It's a very serious threat, and the blacks must have been feeling the pressure as they attempted to include the queen with the queen to f4 move. But this allows Nakamura to gain a tempo for rook to f3. Now, queen to b8 and knight to g5. Here is the perfect harmony of minor pieces combined with rook, which reveals an unbearable pressure. Still, at this point, the rook to f4 could have been an escape move for the blacks. The whites are still vastly superior, but it was best to protect the f7 in this manner. But at the game, Mikhalevski makes a serious mistake and prefers the f5 move. This move, as you can see, has left e6 alone. Now the knight takes e6, double threat. As a result, give the rook and let the king be threatened. The blacks found the solution in rook to c4, but after b takes c4, queen to d6, now h4. Of course, Nakamura doesn't want the last row checkmates to catch him off guard, so he's left a square for the king. Queen to d2, rook f to e3, and queen to c2. At this point, the only hope for the blacks is to attack the opponent's weak pawns. The knight to g5, and all of a sudden, the black king's vulnerable, unprotected, and lonely position drew attention. And In response to the knight to g5 move, Mikhalevski attempted the queen takes c4 move, but you can stop the video and think about it. In 3 moves, the whites play and checkmate. Yes, rook to e8, king to g7, rook 1 to e7, king to f6, and after, the knight takes h7. Nakamura started the game perfectly and finished it perfectly as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel, and click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next videos. Take care!